We are honored to have with us Dan Lipkin, the Anne C. Pingree Director of the Phillips Library at the Peabody Essex Museum. Today, he's going to give a talk on the Salem witch trials and the Peabody Essex Museum itself. So without further ado, Dan Lipkin.
Thank you, Amy, and hi, everybody. Good to be with you today. I'm really delighted to be here to talk to you about the Salem witch trials. Basically, what I'm going to do is I'll give you a tiny bit of background about the library and the museum. PEM is the oldest continuously operating museum in the country. We were founded as the East India Marine Society in 1799, so we've been around for a long time. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that. I'll talk a little bit about our Salem witch trials related collections that we take care of in the museum. And then what I'll do is I'll go through all the exhibitions that I've been involved with in my 5 years at PEM. It's very unusual for a museum to do exhibitions on the same topic, much less the same topic every year for 5 years in a row. And we've approached each of the iterations of our Salem witch trials exhibitions slightly differently. And so I think you might be interested in how we've thought about it and how they've come to be. And I'll talk a little bit about the history and the content as we do that. So without further ado, this is the building that I spend most of my time in. It's the James B. and Mary Lou Hawks Collection Center. It's in Rowley, Massachusetts. It's about 15 miles north of the museum, which is in Salem, Massachusetts. And this is a 120,000 square foot warehouse building. It was a toy manufacturer's distribution facility before we acquired the building in 2017. And the library reading room is there, the library collections, and we are kind of in the process of moving all of our art collections into this building. PEM has about 850,000 objects. The library, as I said, has a reading room, and this is a view of it here. We are open to the public and we're open to anybody who's interested in using our collections, but we are a closed stack library. So that means if you want to see something in our collections, you work with us to request it and we'll bring it out for you to use in our reading room. And this is a view of our library stacks. This is a 19,000 square foot room. These bays of shelves are 12 feet high. The ceilings are 25 feet high. We've got about 350,000 volumes, and all of these boxes here that you see in the front are boxes of manuscripts and archives. So one of our strengths is the history of Essex County and Salem. Salem was the wealthiest place in the country in the early 19th century. The height of the height of maritime trade was about 1795 to maybe 1812. Kind of right, the War of 1812 kind of destroyed all of that. But we have about 1.25 miles worth of shelves full of manuscripts and archives. So millions of pieces of paper, documents, account books, that sort of thing. And this is the collection that me and my staff take care of, share with the public, and one that we're really excited about sharing. We're really, as I mentioned, we're very strong in local history and in maritime trade. The volume you see, picture of this volume you see on the right is what's called a commonplace book. This was done by a British sailor who, in his travels throughout the world, did these really kind of really fun drawings of fish and of vessels that he saw on his voyages. On the left is a logbook of the first merchant to visit Japan. And this logbook was dated 1798 to 1801. This was the time of that voyage. And part of we were founded as the East India Marine Society in 1799. A library was a part of that organization. And one of the requirements of members was that they bring back a logbook of their journals so that other members could learn from their experiences. So this is the first, the ship Franklin, the first ship to visit and trade in Japan. We also are very strong in early American history. This is a very early broadside edition of the Declaration of Independence. This was one that was printed in Salem, and you can tell because it's the only one printed in 4 columns. A copy of this sold in May of 2023 for almost $3 million. So it's a very expensive piece of paper. We have one from a day or two later. This was printed sometime between July 14th and 16th. And we have one from a couple of days later, printed in Boston. That one is also probably a $2 or $2.5 million piece of paper. So we've got some items of value in the collection, which is great. On the left is kind of an example of our Asian collections. This is a set of 90 paper pop-up tea houses depicting historic tea houses from Japan. And this is something that was on view recently in one of our exhibitions. There is a space in the museum dedicated to library collections, and that's a space that I curate exhibitions for. This one is about the segregation and subsequent integration of Salem public schools. In the 1840s, Salem was the first community in the country to integrate their public schools in 1844. So we've got an exhibition about that right now. It's closing in April, and I've got a Moby Dick related show coming up, opening in June. So come on up for that. As far as the Salem witch trials are concerned, we are obviously in Salem, and it's a city of about 40,000 people, and about 1.1 or 1.2 million people come to visit Salem in from about mid-September to the first week of November. So it's a lot of people for a town of 40,000. And a lot of them come for the Halloween parade, to buy witch hats, to go on haunted house tours, that sort of thing. But our responsibility at the museum is really to tell the factual stories of what was a grave injustice in 1692. And this painting is by an artist, an American artist named Tompkins Harrison Madison. This was done in 1859. Depicting, so obviously not in 1692, this was not a painting done from life, but it is a dramatization of the trial of George Jacobs. That's him here in the front. This is one of his canes laying on the ground. He was arthritic and needed 2 canes to get around town. He was also not really a very nice man, from what we understand. And what's interesting about this Madison painting is that it's kind of the iconic image of the Salem witch trials at this point. You see it on book covers. It's kind of the image of choice to represent the trials, even though the costuming, the interior is more of a kind of a Dutch period type of design and setting. So people didn't really dress like this in the 17th century in Salem. But you did get a sense of the drama and the chaos that happened in the courtroom. And so this is something that's really important. That is a touchstone of the exhibition that we've done. And it is currently on view in our American art galleries. I mentioned George Jacobs canes. We have 2 of them in the collection. And so it's actually kind of amazing for us to be able to display one of George Jacobs's canes in addition to the painting that you saw there. We also have documents related to his trial, which I'll mention in a minute. This is a chair owned by Mary English, and Mary and Philip English were the wealthiest people in town. Philip English was a very successful merchant, but also a foreigner, and so he was targeted for his wealth and his foreign origin. You may not be able to see it on the screen, but painted on the chair, on the crossbeam of the chair there, 1692, M. English, and April 22nd, which is when she was arrested under accusations of witchcraft. That was added by Reverend William Bentley, who, if any of you are familiar with Bentley, he was a reverend in Salem. He was like the town busybody. He went on walks multiple times a day and tried to get all the gossip, and then wrote all that gossip down in a diary that he kept between 1795 and when he died in 1819. And what's great about Bentley's diary is that it's a reflection of Salem at its height. And so we've learned a lot from his diary, kind of a 4-volume diary of Reverend William Bentley is kind of the standard reference for Salem at that time. The Colonial Society of Massachusetts is actually working on an unabridged diary, which I think is going to run to 42 volumes, something like that. So the guy liked to talk and he liked to write. He was also, interestingly, I believe he could read 22 or 23 languages. He could speak 7 of them. And so we have records of him kind of leveraging his contacts in the maritime industry to get books from all around the world so he could learn Arabic, for example. Really fascinating story. He was actually mad at Harvard because they wouldn't give him an honorary doctorate. So he gave his books to a small college in northwestern Pennsylvania that his friend was founding, called Allegheny. It was founded in 1814. And that's where I went as an undergraduate. And I didn't know of that connection when I was at the school. But when I arrived at Penn, I learned about Bentley and realized that I had missed seeing his 4,000 volumes at Allegheny. It was the second best library in the country at the time, second only to Thomas Jefferson's. This is a 17th century window from a town family home. And if you've heard of Rebecca Nurse, Mary Easty, or Sarah Cloyce, they were sisters in the town family. And this was a window from one of the town family homes. We don't know which one exactly, but from Topsfield, Massachusetts, kind of nearby Salem. There aren't very many 17th century windows that are still intact, and this one has appeared in multiple exhibitions. This is an object called a tape loom. You may have seen an image of it in Amy's flyer for the exhibition. And this was owned by the Putnam family, and this was used to weave narrow fabric tapes that you would use to reinforce household textiles. You would this is where your legs would be here, so you would hold the tape loom in between your legs and do the weaving kind of in your lap. What's really interesting about this object is that the Putnams were together, they accused more people of witchcraft than anybody involved in the trials, so dozens and dozens of people. And what's interesting about this is that there are some Christian symbols on it, right? There's a heart, there's a triple cross here, kind of symbolizing the Holy Trinity. But there are also kind of folk magic symbols, right? There's a couple of stars, a daisy wheel, a pinwheel, an upside down human head. And so for us, it's been interesting to think about what it means for the Putnams, who were accusers of people, to own an object that had these icons of witchcraft and folk magic, right? What does that mean? And what does that say about the belief system back then? This sundial was owned by John Proctor, who was, he and his wife, Elizabeth, were tavern keepers, farmers. They had a lot of financial interests. This was brass made in London in 1644, indicating for us that the Proctors were wealthy, number one, that they had some knowledge of mathematics and astronomy, because why would you buy a sundial if you had no idea how to use it? And what we have reproduced in this volume here, this is a volume of a reprint of a Robert Califf book called More Wonders of the Invisible World, in which he reproduces a now lost letter from John Proctor. And Califf's report talks about how Proctor, when he was going up to be executed, he was asking for a little bit more time. And so we've played that off of the sundial a little bit in our exhibitions. His wife Elizabeth was pregnant at the time that they were convicted of witchcraft in August of 1692. She was granted a stay and ended up spending another 6 months or so in jail. She was released in early 1693, and because she had been accused of witchcraft, she was considered dead by the state, so she could not inherit John's estate. It's a really very sad story. The baby was born in prison. Really awful things happen to people. And for 40 years, my institution took care of about 530 original manuscripts from the Salem witch trials themselves, documents that are essentially the closest that we have to the facts of all these cases in this tragedy. So on the left, we have a warrant for the execution of Bridget Bishop. It's one of two still in existence. And in this, William Stoughton essentially instructs the sheriff to execute Bridget Bishop 2 days from when this letter was written on June 8th. You can see his wax seal that's still in actually fairly decent shape in the left-hand margin there. And then at the bottom is attached a report from George Corwin, who was the sheriff, and this is what's known as an officer's return. So the officer would attach their report either to the document itself, or they would write the return on the back, essentially reporting back to the court what they had done. And here, he actually says that he has brought Bridget Bishop to the place for her execution and caused said Bridget to be hanged by the neck until she was dead. I mean, he's writing this, and it's a very, I mean, I'm kind of getting goosebumps now just saying it, but this is a very visceral and meaningful document, and really communicates the tragedy of what happened in Salem. On the right is a transcription of the trial of George Jacobs. So you remember the painting I showed earlier and the canes. This is the interviews of George Jacobs himself, as well as the witnesses that testified against him. And the witnesses mentioned those canes because apparently his specter beat them with 2 sticks, right? And so there's this association of the canes themselves, the document, and the painting, and what actually happened. What happened with the documents was that they were put on loan to the Essex Institute, which is an ancestor institution of PEM in 1980 by the state, because these are court documents. They actually belong to Massachusetts. And the agreement was between the Supreme Court and the Essex Institute, and the Supreme Court essentially said, well, in a couple of years, we'll have a nice storage facility ready. And then when we're done with that storage facility, we'll come back to you and recall the loan and put these witchcraft documents back with the rest of our collections. Well, 40 years later, they had finished the facility. This is at Columbia Point in Boston. And a little over a year ago, we actually transferred the witchcraft papers back to the state. And they are now in the archives, and here's me and the archivist of the Supreme Judicial Court, looking very archivist and librarian. Everybody made fun of us because here we are, like 2 guys with beards and glasses in gray suits and ties, being librarians and archivists. But that's our director, Linda Hartigan, on the far left, the Chief Justice of Massachusetts, Kimberly Budd, next to her with the red shirt, and we had this kind of signing ceremony to return the documents. So while it's kind of a bummer that we don't have them anymore in our collection, it's great that they're kind of back home and with the rest of the collection and in a facility that actually is really, really fantastic. I'll also mention, I skipped by this, but I'll also mention that before we return the documents to the state, we digitized all of them using very high resolution photography. We're working on transcribing all the documents, and they are there for folks to use. And we have a collection on our website devoted to the Salem witch trials, and we've set up separate collections for each of the exhibitions that we've done. We also have in our collection, because we are in Salem, we also have a lot of kind of more ephemeral items related to the Salem witch trials. The folks in Salem began to realize that they could monetize the trials and make some money off of products like witch cream for nourishing your skin, or this is a piece of sheet music that could be reproduced and sold and performed. So one of the exhibition ideas we've been kicking around for several years is about that commercialization of this tragedy, and how did Salem come to start thinking about how to make money off of the tourism associated with the witch trials. And we've got lots of kind of really visually striking ephemera like this that we could contribute to an exhibition in that vein, but we haven't gotten there. So I think what I'll do is just start at the beginning in 2020, and a new director joined PEM in say mid-2019. And the following winter, in January, February, he came to me and to Dean Lykainen, who was our American Decorative Arts curator, and he said, okay, you guys are doing a Salem Witch Trials exhibition, and it's gonna open in September, right? Go. And it's actually, museum exhibitions often take years to develop and put together, and we had about 6 months. And as You may remember, COVID also happened in 2020, and so we had we were very challenged as far as getting access to the collection and working together and trying to figure out how to operate in this kind of Zoom-based world. But we did it, and we're really happy with how it came out. And so this is one of the early floor plans by our design team, and you can see these circles here. These are kind of 12-foot diameter circles because we were concerned about, you know, having that 6 feet of space in between people. And so in the layout of this exhibition, we were really thinking about how do we spread objects out to give people enough space to navigate the galleries. Because a lot of people were still very uncomfortable with being in the same physical space as others. We had a little panel outside the gallery because we expected that folks might have to queue up in the hallway. You may see that, you may notice that this 20 here, this is the occupancy of the gallery. So this is about 3,000 square foot gallery. So lots of space for not very many people. We had time tickets, and that was a challenge because the demand was really high. We hadn't had a Salem witch trials exhibition at the museum, even though we had these documents and all these collections related to people who were involved in the trials since 1992. So it had been almost 30 years since we had a witch trials related exhibition at the museum. And that's mainly because the previous director was not really interested in history. He wanted to develop PEM into a kind of a world-renowned art museum, which has had its benefits, but to the neglect of local history. So we were trying to correct that a little bit. This is just the entrance to the exhibition here. And this is actually from a Matterport scan of the gallery, which our marketing team arranged. So you may be familiar with kind of real estate 3D scans of apartments and homes. They did this for the gallery so people could experience it virtually. And all these little red dots were, you know, label text or panel text that you could click on and read. We started with a little section about Salem and early New England, how the ideas about witchcraft were kind of imported from Europe and England into Salem and New England, how they came to Salem. We had an opportunity to display some of our very rare 17th century kind of interior pieces like these two windows, one of which was the town family window I mentioned earlier, 17th century door, one of only two that are known, I believe. And then we open up into the gallery with a map, and then we decided in this version to have displays that were related to people that were involved. So this document was about Tituba, who was an enslaved person in the home of Reverend Samuel Harris. This was her testimony in which she alarmed the Salem community because she said, oh, there are like another 7 witches here. And so that was really shocking to people and indicated that there was a bigger crisis than they had anticipated. So again, associating objects with documents. So we have this kind of the George Jacobs section, and this is how we organize this exhibition by kind of gathering objects and documents around people that were involved in their stories. You may also see the timelines here, the timeline of what happened to Giles Corey and Martha Corey in 1692. Giles was pressed to death on September 19th. He was put between heavy stones. It's the only pressing to death in Massachusetts history. That's a good thing. Yes. Yeah, we haven't had to do that again. Bridget Bishop, who I mentioned, there's the execution warrant, and then we close with a memorial wall naming the 25 people that died unjustly throughout 1692. 5 people died in prison, 19 were hanged, and 1 pressing to death. So we wanted to acknowledge those people, so we gave a sense of what their life dates were, where they were from, and what date they perished. We closed with a little reaction and impact section where we talked about publications that came out in the immediate aftermath of the Salem witch trials and how they led to the ideas that became the First Amendment, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. That's a direct outcome of this book here. that Robert Califf book I mentioned earlier. He was a Quaker and imprisoned and tried for publishing a book very, very critical of the Puritans. He was, the Quakers and the Puritans didn't really get along. And when he was tried, he was acquitted by a jury of mostly Puritans. And that basically established that people could publish things that were critical of the government. And as I said, it eventually led to what became our First Amendment. We also want to make sure to, we also wanted to make sure to point people to other places in Salem and our surrounding area that are related to the witch trials, because a lot of folks come to the region, want to learn more. So there are, you know, the archaeological site of where the Samuel Harris lived over in Danvers, which is the next town over. The Rebecca Nurse House, Jonathan Corwin House. Corwin was a magistrate, and then several of the memorials that are in our area. And we close with a quote from the proposal that led to the establishment of the Witch Trials Memorial in 1992. And this is just an overhead view of the scan of the gallery here, which you can still see on our website if you want to navigate the exhibition. The next year, we were charged with more directly relating the Salem witch trials to contemporary art. And so we had Lydia Peabody, who's one of our associate curators. She kind of deals with contemporary art in our collection. And she joined the team, and we put together an exhibition that related directly to two artists that were descended from people that were involved in the trial. So here's the floor plan. You may remember the last one, but the entrance is up here. So we had folks enter kind of into a Salem 1692 gallery to establish the context and the history. And then folks could go one of two ways. One into a gallery devoted to the work of Alexander McQueen, the British fashion designer, who was a descendant of Elizabeth Howe, an accused witch and executed, and Frances Denny, who was a photographer based in Brooklyn, descended from Samuel Sewell, who was a magistrate, as well as a witch that had been accused in Western Massachusetts around the time of the witch trials. So here's the entrance. We're still working on with these 6 foot, you've probably seen dots in various places, right? Where you can line up 6 feet away from people. And we had lines going all the way back to the atrium. This was kind of deeper into the museum. So view on the in the first gallery here, you may remember the map from 2020. You'll see that recur again and again, as well as views of documents and objects together. Our designers really did it's hard to see on this projection, but one of our designers did this great thing where they actually activated this town family window by projecting light through it. So you got this really fantastic shadow on the floor. We love that. You can see the tape loom there on the left. One of the sides was this Alexander McQueen and Elizabeth Howe gallery. So because we had all 530 documents, we could tell at the time, we could tell the story of Elizabeth Howe through these documents. So we had the original accusation, the warrant for her arrest, her transcriptions of her testimony under examination, testimonies of others both for and against her. And one of the things that was really interesting, as well as a few documents about how she was exonerated for witchcraft later on. Massachusetts took steps to do that. And we paired it with this this gown by Alexander McQueen, which we in fact own, and we've since acquired a second one from the same collection. But Alexander McQueen did this, he visited Salem, did some research on his family, discovered that he was descended from an accused and executed witch, and developed this collection called In Memory of Elizabeth Howe, Salem 1692, which ended up being, he had this kind of big fashion show in Paris in 2007, I think. He had this really large kind of red pentagram on the floor, and the models would come out and walk the pentagram. And the show was about women's empowerment and how women were empowered throughout history. So it was not just Salem 1692 related imagery, but throughout history, Roman, etc. And we also had transcriptions of the documents so people could actually read them. 17th century penmanship is actually quite difficult to decipher in many ways. And so we had these baskets of transcriptions so people could easily read what was in front of them. And you may notice we also had a timeline of what happened in 1692 as well as what happened to Elizabeth Howe. The other side was a photo series called Major Arcana by this photographer, Francis Denny, who spent 3 years traveling America, photographing people who identify today as witches or healers, some at risk to themselves because of the communities they live in. So we had 13 photographs by Francis, who worked with these various people to, they determined how they wanted to be portrayed. And so these pieces of text along with the photograph were actually their words. And part of this project was about reclaiming this idea of the witch identity, right? Because in 1692, the witch identity was imposed on somebody as something that was, accusatory and often meant that the person would be executed. These people are taking back the agency and the power of that term, and that's what this project was about for Francis. So it was a kind of a nice complement to what we were seeing in 1692, because, to be a witch was to be somebody associated with the devil back then. These are just two portraits up close of Shine, who's based in Brooklyn, and Erica, who's actually in Salem. She runs a store in Salem. But these are both now owned by us, by the Peabody Essex Museum. Then we have, in our exhibitions, we like to have what we call chat and relax spaces. So areas where folks can sit, look at a couple of books related to it, and a couple of iPads over there that had digitized documents with transcriptions if folks wanted to look closely at the documents themselves. And then we had a response station. This is something that PEM likes to do too. Like, we like to involve visitors in the conversation. And so the question was, how do you use your voice to speak out against injustice? We had pieces of paper here and pencils for folks to fill out. And we collected literally thousands and thousands of responses, many of which we've actually digitized and are available on the library digital collection site, so you can see what people are saying. And I just kind of tried to keep them organized by month. And I would get packages of them every couple of weeks. And this is our co-curator, Paula Richter here, who's been at the museum for about 40 years. She and I were kind of sorting through some of these responses. And these are just a few. Be magical like a witch, but only for good things. And then this exhibition, we closed with a letter by Francis Dane, who was a reverend in Andover. He had probably a 40 or 50-year record of battling accusations of witchcraft. There was a kind of an outbreak in Andover in the late 1850s that he came out severely against. 28 of his extended family members were accused of witchcraft in 1692, 28. Elizabeth Howe actually was a relative, which kind of was an interesting, I didn't even know that when we started to put this together, so. But in this letter, he basically writes about how the devil has gotten in between the community and how we really need to be more considerate, more tolerant, more understanding, and we just felt like it was a really nice way to kind of wrap up what we were trying to say in this exhibition. So we kind of put it by itself in its own room with a transcript. And then the New York Historical Society called us and wanted to travel the exhibition down to there. So this is just a view from the opening where you can see Paula there, standing there. They decided to reproduce the pentagram on the floor. That was a decision we did not make. And then this is Francis Denny here talking about her photographs. And so it was really exciting to see the exhibition go to New York and see it installed there. They got great response and really high attendance. We didn't design this exhibition to travel, but they were interested in it, and it was a lot of fun to coordinate that with them. The following year, we had a very small pop-up exhibition related to the Town Sisters. As I mentioned, Rebecca Nurse, Mary Eastie, and Sarah Cloyce. So we had 6 documents here on display. just kind of in a hallway between a couple of galleries. But our marketing team decided we needed to have something up, for the fall season, so we did that. This past year, we did an exhibition called the Salem Witch Trials Restoring Justice on view from September to November of last year. And in all of these exhibitions, we've been getting less and less and less space. And so it's been a challenge to try to figure out how do we kind of work with all of these materials and all these documents and all this content, because there's a lot of text in these exhibitions, there's a lot of reading. How do we fit it all in? And one of the tricks with this one is that we only had a single door for both the entrance and the exit, and that's up here in the top middle. So we had to figure out a way to work people around the room and get them to go out the same door without creating too much of a bottleneck, which was, we were kind of successful in that. But our designers did a really, really nice job of helping us to figure that out. We added a section on restoring justice, which I'll talk about in a minute. We put this really large fabric entrance. So this is, the atrium is out in that direction to the left of the image. And so you could actually see this from the ground floor of the museum, and you could easily figure out where you needed to go to get into the exhibition, which was, for wayfinding purposes, that was really, really nice. This is the opening view of the exhibition, Salem 1692, again, kind of setting the stage, the door, the windows, which you remember. And this time, the documents had been returned to the state, so we needed to figure out a way to add reproductions of those documents. And the map again makes an appearance. So these documents are in fact reproductions. They're blown up 150 or 200%, so they're much bigger. We did have a little outline on each of these reproduction panels of the actual size of the document, so our visitors could get a sense of how big how large they were. And a little QR code if you wanted to look at it digitally. The nice thing about having reproductions is that we can light them very brightly if we're using these kind of real original documents, we have to keep the lights very, very low to prevent fading of the ink. That's something that's irreversible. And so with these, we could really blast them with light, which was nice. And I think our visitors enjoyed the opportunity to be able to see them clearly and read them. We redid these panels. We have these timelines again in this exhibition, as well as we sprinkled these little panels throughout the exhibition for other places that people could go to visit around in our region. I think you all could tell me about the tape loom now, right? So I've talked about that quite a bit. And in the distance, you can see this is a life-size reproduction of the Trial of George Jacobs painting. It's not the painting itself, but we did a wall size so that the people in there would be the size of you and me, which actually was a kind of a dramatic way to display the painting, and it really was immersive, which was very nice. A couple of other objects. The sundial is here, as I mentioned, the book with John Proctor's letter in it. That is a reproduction of a cabinet owned by Joseph and Bathsheba Pope, who were accusers of the Proctors. And this was done by craftspeople at what is now Plymouth Patuxent up in Plymouth. Because this was a valuables cabinet, 17th century piece of furniture. We acquired it at auction in the original, not the reproduction. We acquired the original in 2000 or 2001 for $2.1 million. So having a reproduction with the vibrant colors as it would have looked when it was made, ours is very kind of, you can kind of see it in the reproduction up there. It's very brown and dark now. We have a little section on Philip and Mary English, including a sampler that was done by Mary herself. And Philip's cane, which looks very different than kind of the raw tree branches that are the George Jacobs canes. He was a wealthy man, as I mentioned, and there's an ivory cap and a metal tip to his cane. We have two planks from the Salem jail. And those are a feat of engineering for our installers. Those are about 300 pounds each. So they are very tricky to install. The original jail was demolished in the 1950s, and somebody had the presence of mind to actually grab a couple of the beams and save them. And there's still, I think maybe the only 17th century jail that's still extant is over in Barnstable, the old jail in Barnstable, and you can still go inside of it. But this is, we try to kind of create these little environments where people get a sense of, you know, what the jail was like. These are horrible, horrible places full of disease and filth. As I mentioned, 5 people died in prison in 1692. But it's an important part of the story for us to tell. The reproduction of the Jacobs painting along with one of his walking sticks. And you may have noticed as I was going through the color scheme, you know, the green, the yellow, the blue, this very bright red. And one of the things that we wanted folks to think about was the time of year at which the Salem witch trials happened. You know, the first accusations were levied on February 29th. It was a leap year that year. And the crisis really ended in September. So we're talking about a 6-month period, spring and summer. It's not an October Halloween event. So we wanted to step away from the black and orange color scheme. We didn't want to get into that. And we wanted to have colors that were actually fairly fresh and kind of spring and summer-like. You also may notice that these colors were actually taken directly from the Madison painting of the trial of George Jacobs. So there's a link there to one of our artworks. The typeface we used was actually a fairly contemporary looking typeface, and that's because we want to reinforce the idea that we're still seeing injustice today. We're still thinking and dealing with issues like this, false accusations and other things, and you know, still a very contemporary set of ideas that we're thinking. Towards the end, a different configuration of the memorial wall. This is a sealskin trunk that was owned by one of the magistrates, has his initials and nails on the top of it. Again, the memorial wall, we had a little survey for visitors to fill out there. And we closed the exhibition with a section on restoring justice, and restorative actions have been taking place since 1692. People took action in 1692 to try to restore some form of justice to those who were accused or executed. But we see it, in this timeline here on the left, just gives a very brief outline of some of the other restorative actions that have happened over the centuries here in Massachusetts, either actions taken by individuals, actions taken by community groups, or by the state. And we even see, just a couple of years ago, a middle school class in North Andover discovered that a woman named Elizabeth Johnson Jr. had been condemned and never formally exonerated. So they put together a petition, they petitioned their state senator and got exoneration for Elizabeth Johnson Jr. incorporated into the 2022-2023 budget bill. So as of July 1st, I think 2023, Elizabeth Johnson Jr. was formally exonerated. So like this work is still happening, right? Like we're still dealing with what happened in 1692 even today. And a few other documents related to that. We close with a quote that there was not sufficient evidence to prove the guilt of such a crime, which was a letter written by several ministers from Essex County, encapsulating our feelings about it. And finally, we are about to open an ongoing installation on July 6th. And what ongoing installation means is that it's not going to be a 3-month installation, but instead it will be on view for several years, which Paula and I are very glad about. We've been, you know, never let it be said that we do not love the emperor, but you know, we've been doing these exhibitions every year and every year and every year, and we're ready to have a little bit of a break. So we're going to be able to do that. And this document here is a document detailing the examination of several women who had been, the physical examinations of several women who had been accused of witchcraft. And this is going to be, well, I'll show you. So now we have a different triangular gallery in a different space, even slightly smaller. We'll have an entrance here, and then there'll be a staircase coming up from the gallery below. So the question again is, how do we arrange this material to try to eliminate bottlenecks and to try to tell a story that is somewhat coherent? We are including, we did not include a reproduction of this book in the past year's exhibition, but we're including this here. As I mentioned, this is the Thomas Mall book, which eventually led to these ideas of freedom of speech, religion, and the press. So that's a really important kind of long tail effect of the Salem witch trials that we want to include. And this is kind of one of our designers' mock-ups of how the space will look when you enter. You're seeing a lot of very familiar things, right? The colors of the panels, some of the objects associated with each other, and then that document will be very, very large and will essentially be one of the walls of the exhibition. So we're excited to see that happen, as well as the map. Oh, wrong way. And these are just a few isometric views of the gallery to give you a sense of what the space looks like from a 3D perspective. So that's what we're working on. I hope you have an opportunity to come up to Salem to see that and to experience some of the other things that we've got in Salem. We do have a Witch Trials Walk audio tour that you can use to move around the museum as well as walk around town. These are American art galleries. So here's the Pope cabinet in its original form, one of George Jacobs' canes, and the original Tompkins Harrison Madison painting of the trial. We were told that these could not leave the American Art Gallery, so we had to make do without them. But they're there, as well as some of the memorials you see throughout town. The home of Samuel Parsons, where the whole thing began, over in Danvers. A couple of recommendations if you're interested. This, for me, this book by Emerson Baker, Storm of Witchcraft, which was published in 2014, is the best book about the witch trials. It really kind of is the best contextual information. He really covers how they came about. He covers the relationships of people involved in the trials, particularly the magistrates, and how they were actually kind of interrelated. They were all Harvard grads. And then he also talks about the aftermath of the trials and their effect on Salem and the surrounding community. So really, really fantastic. If you want more detail, then if you want enough detail to kill a horse, you can look at records of the Salem witch hunt. This is only 1,000 pages of transcribed documents. So a team of scholars, I think about a dozen scholars worked on this publication for a decade. There's some really great essays in the beginning, but it's about this thick. And it's my go-to source when I want to know about a given document. They retranscribed all the documents, added lots of contextual notes and little things about what's going on in each document. They have little biographical sketches of everybody who is mentioned in the documents. A really great book, but highly, highly detailed. If you want something in a fiction vein, I recommend I Titubo, Black Witch of Salem by Maurice Condé from the mid-80s. It's short, so you can get through it, but it's really evocative and really well done. I love it. And if you're into movies, I recommend Robert Eggers' The Witch. I'm a real wimp. Like, I don't do horror movies. Like, I can't, the first time I watched this, I kind of watched it through my fingers. And it's not the Salem witch trials per se, but historians of 17th century material culture all pretty much unanimously agree that this is the best depiction of what it was like in New England at the time. It is a little scary and a tiny bit gory, but not too much. Again, like, I'm really weak, so like I can't handle a lot. But this one, it's really, really fantastic, and I highly, highly recommend it. I did a panel with Emerson Baker, but we had a showing of the screening of this at the museum. And Emerson Baker and I had a little conversation before we screened it, and it's really worth seeking out. And finally, our digital collections. For the library, penn.org library/digital, we have a really large collection of our Salem witch trials material, as well as lots of other things that you might find interesting. So you're more than welcome to check that out. All you need is the internet. And I think that's all I have to say. So thanks for your attention. I'm glad to take questions if you have any, and I really appreciate it. Yes,
So, George Jacobs cane.
Yeah.
And objects like that, where are they kept? Are they kept in that huge building that you showed that you worked with, or are they kept in some other kind of archival storage place?
when they're not on view in the gallery, they are in that collection center, yes. So I don't have any images of it, but we have other rooms like the library stacks where some of the rooms look like Home Depot, you know, with the big pallet racking, right? And so, but there's also cabinetry that objects fit into. It just depends on the curatorial department, how big they are, that sort of thing. But that building is fully climate controlled, secure, there's always security staff there. No. So they're very, very safe, but when they're not in the galleries, they're in storage. Yeah. Yes. Oh,
Me?
sure, yes.
I like to think about, this in the past, and what is going on in the present time.
Mhm.
And, so, I was thinking about, back then, there were people that really believed that there were witches.
That's correct.
And what they were doing was the proper thing to do. But I was wondering if there were also, has there been people written about, are there other people that maybe were doing what they were doing for political reasons rather than what they really believed?
There were people who were making accusations for political reasons. And actually, one of the things that helped bring the Salem witch trials to an end was because accusations were starting to reach the upper echelons of the government, right, of the Puritan kind of governance of the colony. And so as soon as somebody's wife gets accused, somebody was like, well, hold on a second, like, I don't know about that, and that's one of the things that encourages the state to shut the door on what's happening and to step back and to say, we've allowed testimony based on this, what's called spectral evidence, where, I can say that, I see you have a familiar, or you're doing something to me, or you're pinching me, and nobody else can observe that, but if I say that's happening, then the court believes it. This is, I think that once the accusations start to get political, that's when the state realizes that it's gone too far. There were people all along who were trying to raise that warning for people who were involved. We have documents from March of 1692 where folks were writing to the court saying this person is not a witch. We've known this person for 20 years. They're a good Christian. They're a good member of the community. But I think, people get caught up in this groupthink, right? And people start to not think clearly about what's going on. So there were a whole variety of reasons why this happened in Salem. There were conflicts, there were religious conflicts, right? The Puritans and the Quakers didn't get along. There were conflicts between Salem town and Salem village, right? Salem village was a little bit more in the country. They had set up this separate parsonage where Samuel Parris was. He was kind of a jerk. So he was kind of pitting people against each other. There was some disputes over property, not too much, but there were conflicts to the north where there was this war with the indigenous and the French populations, and refugees were coming down from the borderlands, right? So that was adding to the burden on people. The weather was really extreme. There were very, very hot winters, very cold, or sorry, the other way. Hot summers, cold winters. And so this extreme weather was happening, which was damaging crops, which meant there was less food and, so there were all these stressors that kind of came together in Salem that kind of established this feeling of, unease and suspicion. And that's what drove, there wasn't one thing that made people succumb to this way of thinking, and to allow for the explosion of accusations that happened. There was a new charter that had arrived in 1691, which meant that it was easier to accuse people and you didn't have, it was easier to accuse people of something and you didn't have any burden of proof in the same way. You didn't have to kind of be responsible for your actions in that sense. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yes, and the how they got out of that problem is could be interesting to us
Right.
now.
Yeah, I mean, I think once they decided that spectral evidence was not going to be accepted any longer, then the Supreme Court was reconvened in January of 1693. And you see these cases reconsidered, and then now that these false accusations can't be taken into evidence, well, guess what? You're innocent, right? I mean, it's no surprise, really. You had a question, sir?
Yes, did they look for a particular shape of a birthmark on people accused of being witches?
Not a particular shape, but
Okay.
a birthmark. I mean,
Any birthmark?
yeah. It was, there were a lot of options for, if you wanted to make sure that if you wanted somebody to be guilty, there was a way that you could identify something, right? I
But
mean,
no birthmark meant exoneration?
I wouldn't say it was that clear.
Okay.
But everybody's got some kind of mole or skin irregularity or skin tag or something, like they're always gonna find something. But these I'm sorry, I'll get to you. These examinations were, I mean, they must have been completely terrifying because people were dragged into a room, they were stripped naked and every inch of their body was examined. I mean, it must have been horrible. It's hard to imagine what this must have been like for people. Yes,
So I read a bit about all of this and you read about the executions, but I don't have any knowledge about what happened after that, the burial of these people. Since it was such a demonic thing, were they allowed to be buried with family or outside of their religious graveyards, churchyards?
they were buried in a very kind of minimal way. And certainly not in church graveyards. A lot of these folks had been obviously excommunicated from their parishes. There are some reports that families would come to the site near the executions where bodies had kind of been like lightly covered over and actually take the bodies home. Rumor has it that that's how we have some of Rebecca Nurse's remains at that homestead in Danvers. But these people had been accused of witchcraft, which meant that their blood was tainted and they were essentially not people any longer.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes,
I wondered what the court's role was in all the hysteria. It seems like if somebody might have come to their senses or something and realized, this is wrong, I wondered how they got caught up in the whole.
well, I think they were, most of the magistrates were tied up in the Puritan government and kind of the ruling class and I think there was a sense that these accusations could bring down the state. And similarly, once sentiment had kind of turned, then opinions of how the Puritans had mismanaged the whole thing and innocently killed people would also lead to the downfall of the Puritan government. And so that's one of the reasons why that Thomas More book is so important, because he came out soon after the trial. He was very, very critical of the Puritans. There actually had been, in October of 1692, the governor forbade any publication about the witch trials, because they didn't want any criticism to be levied at them, because they thought, and probably rightfully so, that it would bring down the government. But a lot of the magistrates were very deep in this crisis, and Stoughton himself was, you know, kind of itching to get people accused because they wanted to get this crisis taken care of, and the colony kind of purged of any witchcraft. There was a magistrate, Nathaniel Saltonstall, who quit the court because he didn't agree with the direction that it was going. Samuel Sewell, who I mentioned, was the only magistrate to publicly express guilt and shame for his actions in the trials, and many of the other magistrates never spoke of it, which is kind of interesting. Yeah.
I'm a descendant of Sarah Cloyce, so I have a particular interest there.
Yeah.
How much information is there at the library on her trial documentation? Because there's a lot of disagreement among scholars whether she escaped prison, whether she was freed, and then the connection with Governor Danforth after that, providing homestead in Framingham for the family.
Yeah.
Is there accurate information about that one could get a better opinion than the disagreement?
Yeah, I think there is, and you know, we do our best to collect as much material as we can about the witch trials, you know, scholarly books and otherwise. But there's a ton of, you know, and I don't know the details of a lot of cases myself. You know, I know a little bit about Sarah Cloyce because of her association, you know, in the town family. But there's plenty of stuff out there to look at and read and to think about. Actually, the one thing I might recommend is to contact the Salem Witch Museum. In Salem, there's a separate witch museum that's right on the common, and they've built this really neat kind of product called descendant packets, whereas if you're a descendant of so-and-so, you can purchase a descendant packet, and that'll kind of get you started on the research of the person you're interested in. But there's a lot out there. And there are books coming out about the trials every year, and it's kind of overwhelming. Yeah. Yes.
So did some of the families end up leaving the area?
Yes.
So for example, I haven't looked at this in a while, and I don't know who the previous generation is, but there's a Levi Preston who married a Mary Fuller in Killingly, Connecticut.
Mhm.
And I get the impression that those folks were originally in the Salem, Danvers area. So did they, whether they were accusers or accused, were they so horrified that they?
I think that has a lot to do with it. Yeah, I mean, the town family, several members of the town family relocated to Framingham, which is, you know, West Boston, and I think people, you know, in 1693, how do you walk down the street? You know, if you had been accused, or if you had accused others, like, I just don't. And I think this is one of the reasons why it took Salem 300 years to build a memorial to the trials, right? I mean, how do you face people after something like this had happened? Like, I just don't, it's another thing, I just can't wrap my mind around it. And I think some folks decided that the way to deal was to leave, and to move elsewhere and start fresh. So yes, people left the area, you know, and there are millions of descendants of people who were involved in the trials. I mean, you know, 170 something people were accused. There are 400 something people that were involved in testifying or submitting petitions. And so, and this is kind of the cradle of Massachusetts and New England at the time. So, there are millions of people out there that were involved and people did scatter. But yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with trying to deal with this terrible injustice that happened.
What was the popular, well, first of all, we're descendants of Margaret Scott, so this
Great,
is very
yeah,
fascinating,
yeah.
Also, but what was the population?
Rowley resident, I think she was in Rowley, right, yeah.
What was the population of Salem and the surrounding areas at that time? I'm just trying to get a perspective of if 400 people were involved, how many, what percentage of the area was involved?
That's a really good question, and I used to know that number off the top of my head, and I've totally forgotten it. The accusations went from all the way up in Wells, Maine, which is kind of southern Maine, all the way west to Billerica. And, this is a huge swath of territory, particularly at that time. I don't know the number. I'm sorry, I can't recall it.
How, like, as you're saying, how it impacted the community to have.
I mean, these aren't huge communities, right? This is 1692,
40,000.
right?
Had to have 400 people
Right.
involved.
And actually, and over time, you may have noticed on the map, like we have this kind of like large white border drawn. Salem was kind of much bigger because, see if I can get one quickly here, but Salem was much bigger, and over time, as populations grew, it split into multiple communities, and incorporated. So kind of this area here, this yellow line was the area of Salem in 1692, but now it's Beverly and Wenham and Hamilton and Middleton and all these different places have split off.
According to Google, 550 people at that time.
Wow.
And it consisted of
In-
Middleton. as
In
well.
in the entire area of Salem?
Danvers, as well as the town of Middleton and
Yeah.
the city of Peabody.
Yeah.
So it's that area.
Yeah.
It's 90 households.
Yeah. In Andover, I mean, there were a lot of accusations in Andover too, which was a fairly populous place. I think more accusations in Andover than in Salem, probably. Yes,
What do they consider, the woman who gave birth to the baby in jail?
Mhm.
What about that baby? Do they consider that baby sort of inheriting the mother's?
That's- I'm not sure what the answer is, but I would expect that because she was dead in the eyes of the state, so was the baby. And it's interesting that over time, these waves of exonerations happen. The first ones in 1711. As early as 1695, people start petitioning the government for some kind of restitution and exoneration. Philip English spent almost the rest of his life trying to get his property back, because when he was accused and arrested, his property was seized by the sheriff. Who knows what happened to it? They fled to Boston and then were jailed in Boston and then fled again to New York. And then when the trials were over, they came back to the region, and like I said, he spent the rest of his life trying to get some kind of restitution for all the property he had lost. He was the richest guy in town, and he got a fraction of what he was owed. Well, what's interesting is that after the trials end, what you have is the people who had surviving family members or relatives or friends were the people who got on those first rolls of exoneration because they had people to advocate for them. Later on, it was discovered that, so-and-so was never formally exonerated by the state, but that's because they didn't have a family member to say, you need to exonerate this person. And so that's why you have, there was a whole raft of people exonerated in 2001. And that's why Elizabeth Johnson Jr. slips through the cracks. It's kind of, it's interesting to see it happen over time for people to really look at it and realize that somebody had never been cleared of the crime, which is a fake crime, but And I think part of my theory is part of what's fascinating about this whole thing is that we can't really know we can't know everything that happened. A lot of this is totally mysterious. And a lot of it is lost to time and, even some of these documents, these transcriptions, they're only so accurate. One of the court transcribers was Samuel Paris, who was the father of people who would, these girls who would levied the first accusation. So that's a total conflict of interest. Like that would never be allowed today in court. So you also have to think about like how reliable are these documents, even though those are kind of the closest thing we have to the facts of what happened. And it's kind of amazing to me, like how compelling this set of events is for people. It's like, it's endless, like the thirst is endless, which is cool. But also amazing. I mean, this is 330 years ago. We're still talking about it.
I just have a fun fact though for Sandwich, and maybe the owner of this home won't be happy that I mentioned it, but we do have a replica of the house with 7 tables.
Oh, yeah.
There's a neighborhood that's been built. That was
Yeah.
several, like, captain's houses.
That's right.
Who has that?
I should mention that one of the reasons I'm here is because I'm originally from Sandwich. And it's nice to be back.
And you are.
Pardon me?
You already do.
I've been in a house, well, I know where that house is, but yeah. Great.
One of
Well-
the many reasons.